I'm DuRand, a retired philosophy professor. I taught for 40 years at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. Before moving to San Miguel, and being one of those that founded the Center for Global Justice, which is now been in operations here for 10 years. I've been an activist in various progressive movements since the 1960s. It was the civil rights movement in the 60s that politicized me. I developed my social consciousness in that. And that was while I was in graduate school. And I went from that then to teaching at a historically black university. That's where I spent my 40 years of teaching. As a way of linking up with a people in struggle for social justice. I originally came from North Dakota. That's where I grew up. I call North Dakota a third world country because it was underdeveloped agricultural country, exporting basically agricultural goods and now minerals from oil, but with very little industry in the state. We always used to say that North Dakota's two chief exports are wheat and people. Okay, so enough about me. Let's get into the topic for today. The article in Attention billed the topic as the collapse of the middle class. And before I get into my talk, I need to say a word about this term, the middle class, because it is a very ill-defined term. For example, those of you who saw Robert Weich's film, Inequality for All, the definition that he gave for the middle class was, he said, well, you take the median income, and then those who, the 25% above that, and the 25% below that, that's the middle class. Well, that's not really a class that he's talking about. It's a statistical category, right? But it's not a class in any serious sense of that term. And frequently, the term middle class is used in that way, simply to refer to a statistical category, a grouping of people who don't have anything else in common except that they're in a certain income range. Now, there are middle classes, plural, in American society, not a singular class in the middle, that is between the lower class and the upper class. There are other classes in the middle. Most wage workers fall in that category. There's the professional managerial class that falls in that category, in that space between the upper and the lower class. So we can talk about middle classes and use the term class in a rigorous way, but there isn't a singular middle class, as popular discourse would lead you to believe. As I get into my talk, I'll try to unpack what it is that those who are in the middle have in common. It is expressed in what we call the American dream. Now, a continuation of the economic crisis that hit in 2008, and still, still ongoing, has driven home a social trend that has been evident actually since the late 1970s, namely the decline of what is popularly called the middle class, and the accompanying American dream. The American dream is the belief that if you work hard, if you are blessed with at least a modicum of ability, and have a little luck maybe, you can succeed. That is, you can rise in society, no matter how humble your origin, to something better in the way of material well-being, economic security, a settled life, and social prestige. It is, in other words, the dream of upward mobility for oneself, or at least for one's children. Now, as economist Richard Wolff has pointed out, this upward mobility was a reality for most USians for several generations. In fact, from 1820 to 1970. For 150 years, real wages rose. In the quarter century from 1947 to 1973, that is the quarter century after World War II, average real wages rose an astounding 75%. And that's calculated in real dollars. But that shared prosperity came to a halt in the mid-70s. In the next 25 years, from 1979 to 2005, wages and benefits rose less than 4%. 75% increase, now to a 4%.
What year was that?
The quarter century from 1979 to 2005.
Okay.
The sustained rise in standards of living had been made possible by a conjunction of historical circumstances, circumstances that began to reach exhaustion by the mid-70s. Post-World War II prosperity was based on at least 5 factors I would mention. The global economic dominance of the U.S., no competitors in other industrialized countries of the world in world markets. The U.S. was the only country that came out of World War II with its industrial infrastructure intact. Second, there was pent-up consumer demand from the Depression and war years. Third, there were supportive social programs. Fourth, some political clout due to a strong union movement that could demand a share of the prosperity. And last, Keynesian stimulus, infrastructure development like interstate highway system, and military spending. Well, those were the major factors that converged in that post-World War II quarter century to produce an unprecedented era of economic growth and prosperity that was broadly shared with much of the population. That's what's often referred to as the golden age of capitalism. But by the mid-1970s, an over-accumulation crisis emerged, reflected in stagflation. Remember the talk about stagflation back in the 70s? Simultaneous inflation and lack of economic growth. That's because there were insufficient places to profitably invest all of the surplus capital that had accumulated during the years of prosperity. The situation was set forth with unusual candor by former IMF director Jacques Larosset. In a 1984 policy address, he said, I'm quoting, "Over the last 4 years, the rate of return on capital investment in manufacturing in the 6 largest industrial countries averaged only half the rate earned during the late 1960s. even allowing for cyclical factors, a clear pattern emerges of a substantial and progressive long-term decline in rates of return on capital. There may be many reasons for this, but there is no doubt that an important contributing factor is to be found in the significant increase over the past 20 years or so in the share of income being absorbed by compensation of employees. This points to the need for a gradual reduction in the rate increase in real wages over the midterm if we are to restore adequate investment incentives. Close quote. In other words, in order to ensure adequate profits to capital, workers' incomes had to be curtailed. Well, the policies that made this suppression of incomes possible came to be called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, a public ideology represented by President Ronald Reagan in the US and Margaret Thatcher in England. Neoliberalism involves the withdrawal of government from directing the economy, leaving it instead to market forces. This meant deregulation, privatization of the commons, free trade. And that required weakening the collective hand of workers by an assault on unions and social benefits so as to strengthen the hand of capital. Free trade policies of our political elite were a key part of the neoliberal offensive against labor. Trade agreements like NAFTA promoted the export of entry-level jobs to low-wage countries in the global south, like here in Mexico. With globalization, beginning in the 1980s, those entry-level industrial jobs that had made possible mobility into middle-income levels were the first jobs to be sent offshore, where they could be done by low-wage workers in the third world. For instance, hourly compensation costs in manufacturing, that is wages plus benefits, amount to $1.50 or less in China, compared with $33 in the United States. The Economic Policy Institute has recently calculated that in the last decade, U.S. trade with China has cost the U.S. 2.7 million jobs. And those were what had once been good-paying union jobs, by and large. The globalization of capital was the fix that was found for the crisis of overaccumulation. Investment was sent abroad to low-wage areas of the global south, where goods could be produced cheaply and then sold to higher-income consumers in the north. By 2008, 48% of all sales by the top 500 U.S. corporations were items produced abroad. This can be readily verified by looking at the made-in labels, clothing, electronics, automobiles, myriad other consumer goods. Even more ominously, opportunities for investment were opened up by free trade agreements like NAFTA and later the World Trade Organization. At the same time, the bargaining power of U.S. labor was curtailed by capital's threat to move production abroad, along with a government-endorsed campaign against unions. This restored corporate profits, but stagnated working U.S.'s wages. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which is the club of the rich countries in the world, now reports that the U.S. has the lowest rate of upward mobility of all industrialized countries. It is even seeing downward mobility. Witness the decline in entry-level wages. From 2001 to 2008, entry-level pay for high school graduates declined by 4%. For college graduates, the decline was 7%. For example, when my son graduated in computer networking from a community college in 1997, his first job was with the Sylvan Learning Center. 15 years later, his son graduated from a university, and a classmate got that very same job at exactly the same salary. Allowing for inflation, Sylvan now gets a university graduate for less than it used to pay for a graduate of a 2-year program. In recent decades, the economy has grown, and there was a gain in total wealth. But where did it go? From 1983 to 2008, total U.S. GDP grew from $6 trillion to $13 trillion in constant 2005 dollars. The unequal distribution of the total wealth gain during this period is revealing. The wealthiest 5% of American households captured 81% of the gain. The bottom 60% of households not only failed to share in the overall increase, they suffered a 7.5% loss. Some of what the top 1% gained came directly from that bottom 60%. Now, let me show that in this chart. This one. What we have here is the share of total wealth gain, not total wealth, but the increase in wealth during this 26-year period. The top 1% got 40% of the increase in wealth. The next 4% got 41%. So between them, the top 5% got over 80%. The next 5% got 10% of the wealth gain. The next 10% below them got 9.8%, 5.7% for the middle fifth, or the upper middle fifth. And then down here, we have 20%, another 20% of the population, another 20%, each experiencing a loss in wealth. Now, if you add up the gains, now that's the bottom 60% of the population. If you add up the gains of the top 40%, it's more than 100%. How did they get more than 100% of the wealth gain? By taking some away from the bottom 60%. That's why you get the negative.
Hold it up.
Yeah.
You just hold it up?
No. Those across the room.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Oh, much better.
So you can see it better.
Want me to hold it for you when you come?
Okay, well, I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but
No, that's
I did want everybody to see this chart because it's very revealing. It really tells a big part of the story of what is happening in the economy of the U.S. In other words, the bottom 60%, and actually more, is experiencing downward mobility. You know, after the post-World War II spurt of economic growth where they gained phenomenally, now those gains are being eroded. Previously, it had been possible for a young man just out of high school to get a good paying, unskilled job in a unionized factory. That enabled him to buy a house in the suburbs with a federally insured mortgage and send his kids to college with government-supported student loans. This was a common road to the success promised in the American dream. Millions achieved that coveted upward mobility. Under the illusion that they were no longer working class, they thought of themselves as a new class in the middle, somewhere between the rich and the poor, a middle class. That's when the term came into prominent use. It is neoliberal globalization that has now blocked that road for more and more people. For the first time in generations, the next generation has a lower standard of living than their parents. We're the last of the privileged generation. With the offshoring of manufacturing, the industrial region of the Northeast and the Great Lakes were transformed into a rust belt. U.S. manufacturing employment peaked in 1979 at almost 20 million and fell under neoliberalism to about 11 million by 2010. Today, 80% of the world's industrial workforce is now in the global south. It's really a shocking figure if you think about it. Because most of that industrial workforce used to be in the U.S. This is in no small measure the result of corporate policies over the last 30 years. Policies encouraged by our political leaders. Policies to offshore those low-skilled industrial jobs that used to be the entry point to the middle class for many USians. That may create the conditions for middle classes, so-called, in Brazil and China and even in Mexico, but it shrinks those in the middle in the US, pushing people's living standards downwards. Basically, capital is destroying the middle class at home and reconstituting it in parts of the global south. As less skilled industrial jobs were offshored, at first in the 90s, we were told by Robert Reich, who was then Labor Secretary in the first Clinton administration, that to remain competitive in the global economy, U.S. workers needed to upgrade their skills. We were told the new economy would be the new road to the American dream. We're still being told that. But offshoring of jobs has not been limited to low-skilled assembly line work. Corporate capital has discovered that any job that can be done by a computer can be done anywhere in the world, and consequently will be done wherever the cheapest workers with the requisite knowledge can be found. So the knowledge economy jobs are now also being offshored to countries like India. The knowledge workers there will work for far less than in the US. And many of our college graduates today are saddled with heavy debt and unable to find work. As a result of public and corporate policies, there's been a wage stagnation for the last 30 years, even as worker productivity rose sharply. And that's what is shown in this other graph that I have here. This is one of my favorites. It's Jeff Cohen's favorite also. Some of you may have seen it. It shows the rise in productivity, which is this red line, over the years from 1993 to 2006, compared with the wages. Now, there's a version of this chart actually that goes back to earlier years, before 1993, out to the late 1940s. And through that golden era of capitalism, golden age of capitalism, productivity and wages rose together. Workers had the bargaining leverage that enabled them to claim a share of the increased productivity of their labor. But by the 1990s, the rise in wages tended to level off as productivity continued to soar. The gap between those represents a major source of the increased wealth of those who own capital. Corporate profits are up, and it's because they've been able to keep wages down in a number of ways. Capital took the bulk of productivity gains. But then with the 2008 financial crisis, median family income declined further by nearly 10%. Overall, as incomes have declined, corporate profits have soared. For a while, wealth had appeared to increase for average USians because of inflating real estate values. But the financial crisis of 2008 wiped out that fictitious wealth. Median family wealth in 2010 was the same as it had been 20 years earlier. It's important to understand that the undermining of the American dream came at the hand of capital and government working in collusion. It is corporate capital's unquenchable thirst for profit and political leaders' eagerness to assist them that is destroying that dream. It's not blind economic forces operating with the inevitability of natural law, but the conscious policies, CEOs, and political leaders that is replacing upward mobility with downward mobility. Political leaders, Democrats and Republicans alike, embrace Charles Wilson's adage that what's good for General Motors is good for America. Well, what truth might once have been embraced by this identification of national interest with corporate interest has long since been invalidated by the globalization of capital. That is a central point in my book, Recreating Democracy in a Globalized State. Corporate-led neoliberal globalization has transformed nation states into what I call globalized states. That is, states that serve the interests of transnational capital above the interests of their own national populations. This tendency is strong in both states of the global north, like the US, and the global south, including Mexico. This has resulted in a limitation of sovereignty and the possibility for democratically shaped national policies. Increasingly, the fate of countries is beholden to powerful transnational corporations rather than their own people. In the US, there's long been bipartisan consensus behind globalization and the neoliberal policies that promote it. Both parties have long embraced basic public policies that have been undermining the economic security of millions of working people. This is fully substantiated by Jeff Foe in his book, The Servant Economy. Some of you may have heard him talk about that last month. He argues that, and I'm quoting, the elites are unanimous, lower everyone's wages and standard of living, except they don't say it out loud. Both parties favor no strings, Wall Street bailouts, expanded, unregulated trade, weakened unions, and fiscal austerity as an economic priority, even though that means shredding social programs. There may be some difference in degree on these issues, but both parties are in basic agreement. As Fo points out, the mantra of both candidates in the last election was jobs, jobs, jobs. What they leave out is they are unwilling to confront the power of Wall Street and the Pentagon. Job growth in America now depends on driving labor costs lower and lower to attract business investment. 1/3 of all working families are now poor. That is, the annual incomes of families of 4 is below the $45,000 poverty threshold, and incomes insufficient to meet basic needs. Well, this bipartisan consensus is illustrated by Senate approval a couple years ago of free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. While all politicians were calling for more jobs, they approved a free trade agreement that they knew would destroy jobs. This was evident in the fact that approval of the free trade agreement is accompanied by extended unemployment benefits for displaced workers. It's like they just can't help themselves when an opportunity arises to favor transnational corporations. And now the Obama administration is set to expand this folly even further with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. An Economic Policy Institute study shows that increasing wage inequality is the result of deliberate and reversible policy decisions. Ever since around 1978, each administration and Congress have made choices: expanding trade, deregulating finance, weakening welfare, that help the rich and hurt everyone else. Inequality didn't just happen, the government created it. As we've seen, the result of these policies is that wages have been stagnant for the last 30 years and are now even declining. Jeff Fo projects that by the mid-2020s, we can expect about a 20% drop in the real wages of the average American who has to work for a low and moderate standard of living. Corporations have put U.S. workers into competition with low-wage workers in China, Mexico, and other areas of the global South. And this has happened with the full support of our political leaders. They all seem intent on realizing New York Times, Thomas Friedman's vision of a flat world. That is a world where globally high-income earners are brought down to a lower level, and those at the bottom rise up some, resulting in global income averages far below what those in the global world once found acceptable. Let me move on to another aspect of this topic, what I call meritocratic individualism. The ironic thing about neoliberal policies is the extent to which political support for them has come from those sectors of society that have been harmed by them. This was quite pronounced, for example, in the mid-1990s, when the conservatives took control of the House of Representatives under the leadership of Newt Gingrich. Their contract on America called for dismantling the very social programs that had facilitated the upward mobility achieved by the white suburban voters who had elected them to office. How are we to understand this strange phenomenon? People voting against the very programs that had enabled them to realize the American dream. Well, what exactly is that dream? It takes many forms for different groups at different historical moments. As we've seen, underlying them all is the dream of achieving the good life by individual upward mobility through one's efforts. This dream is based on the perception that the society offers the opportunity for such mobility, so that it is up to the initiative of the individual to seize these opportunities and make something of oneself. The idea that one can make something of oneself is the mark of an achievement-oriented society. That is, a society in which social status and rewards are not ascribed by birth or membership in a particular group, but are instead achieved by virtue of one's own talent and efforts. Thus, social success is seen as merited, something that the individual has earned. It is a meritocratic individualist dream. The key elements of the American dream are then meritocratically achieved status through individual effort where opportunities are available. Summarized in this formula here. Okay. You can keep your neck around. The success that the American dream aims for requires that the individual make an effort. He may have talent, but talent doesn't guarantee his success. He has to develop and use that talent, which takes effort. Those two, plus an element of luck, frequently helps being in the right place at the right time. But in a very simplified form, those are the elements that are generally understood as leading to achievement of the American dream. However, one of the factors that the American dream tends to overlook is the importance of social institutions that support these efforts and thereby make the success of individuals possible. These institutional supports may be provided by a community, by a social group or class, or by government. But it is through them that the larger society nurtures its members. Meritocratic individualism tends to blind us to these social supports, enabling individuals to then take full credit to themselves for their success. It is precisely this blind spot that leads many to disown the very social supports that enable their success. They don't think about the federally insured mortgages that made it possible to buy that house in the suburbs, the federal highway program that made it feasible to live far from where they work, the union that won better pay for their jobs so they could afford to move out of the city, the student aid programs, and the university itself that provided an educational opportunity, prepared them for better jobs. And I could go on with a list of social supports that undergird the lifestyle of the middle classes. The health system that keeps them alive. The food standards program that protects against unsafe food. The occupational safety and health agencies that protect them against unsafe working conditions. The Social Security program that lifts the burden of supporting elderly parents from the shoulders of young families and offers them some financial security in their own old age, etc., etc. Indeed, there are myriad ways that are not fully appreciated in which society supports its members. So, a more complete formula should add social supports. It's not just talent and effort, but also adding institutions in society that support its members. That makes possible what is thought of as individual success. The fact that the importance of social institutions is downplayed in the meritocratic individualist ideology has two effects. First, those who have benefited from these supports tend to deny them, thinking they will taint the merit of their accomplishments. And second, it tends to undermine political support for the very institutions we need to support us. It leads to the self-congratulatory belief that I built this myself. Remember, that was the Republican mantra in the last presidential election? The once comfortable suburbanites fail to realize that it is not only the poor who benefit from social programs, but they themselves as well. That they have been blind to this is due to their own meritocratic individualistic ideology. They can understand outcomes only in terms of individual effort and talent. This opened the way for what has now been a 3-decade-long offensive by the right against social programs and government itself, leaving our fate in the invisible hand of the market. And that has resulted in the end of the American dream. Now, I've been referring to middle classes. Let me say a word about the usefulness of middle classes. Their role in the larger social scheme of things. It's generally accepted that large, prosperous middle classes or middle strata are vital to the future of the U.S. You hear that notion from President Obama these days, who is putting forth ideas to promote broadly based sustainable growth. Now, there are both economic and political reasons for having middle classes. Economically, the health of capitalism requires a large sector of consumers with sufficient income to be able to buy what is produced. That is a reality that Henry Ford taught a century ago when he raised the wages of his workers so they could buy his automobiles. Without effective consumer demand, capital cannot realize profits. Mass production requires mass consumption, and mass consumption means there has to be disposable income for people. That's a reality that has become evident today in the long recession that the economy is now in. Businesses are not investing, and jobs are not being created because there is low consumer demand due to high unemployment and high consumer debt. But that then results in higher unemployment and a vicious downward spiral that is evident to all those whose perceptions are reality-based. This has been pointed out twice a week by Paul Krugman in his New York Times columns. It's one of the themes that he always harps on. And now the point has been made by another Nobel Economics Prize winner, Joseph Stiglitz, in his book, The Price of Inequality: How Today's Divided Society Endangers Our Future. Politically, that was economic. Politically, prosperous middle strata are important for stability. As the term middle class is usually used today, it involves an expectation of upward mobility, rising income, and comfortable and secure standard of living. It is this upward mobility that is of particular political importance. Political stability is enhanced by having a sizable sector of the population who believe they have an opportunity to improve their condition in the existing system, or at least their children. That is why the existence of a so-called middle class is widely considered to be of crucial importance for a stable democracy of the U.S. type. It is at the heart of the American dream. The American dream has been a key legitimating myth in our society. Regardless of the inequalities that exist, the injustices suffered, the sacrifices endured, the American way of life has been generally accepted as good by most of the population because it has been believed that it still offers the opportunity for upward mobility toward a better future. Thus, this ideology has been a force for social stability. It has led many to accept the status quo, even to defend it, because of the expectation, if not the hope, that life will get better for them if they but work hard and play by the rules. With the growing downward mobility now being experienced, the social contract is unraveling. The legitimacy of dominant institutions is being questioned. We all know that public confidence in Congress, as well as government in general, is at an all-time low. Large banks are viewed correctly as criminal. Blind faith in market magic has been dispelled, and corporations are even seen as having betrayed the nation. The legitimacy of the system of capitalism is in crisis, as sizable percentages now have a positive view of socialism as an alternative. And this is particularly among the young, who have not known the rabid anti-communism of the Cold War era. As the national elections in 2008 and 2012 have shown, the people of the United States are asking for far-reaching changes, more change than the political elite is willing or even able to deliver. If we limit our optic to the U.S., or even if we expand it to include the other advanced capitalist societies, the prospects for resumption of significant endogenous economic growth are dim. That has been the argument of Northwestern University economist Robert Gordon in his widely discussed National Bureau of Economic Research paper titled, "Is the U.S. Economic Growth Over?" Gordon predicts a dark future of epical decline in growth from the U.S. record of the last 150 years. The greatest innovations, Gordon argues, are behind us, with little prospect for transformative change along the lines of the three previous industrial revolutions. Without new major innovations to offer opportunities for profitable investment, where is all the accumulated capital to go? Here again, we have a classic overaccumulation crisis. One fix that has been deployed by the corporate wealthy is to reduce their tax burden, shifting it to the popular classes below. This has been the agenda of their sector of the political elite for decades. That has been combined with the neoliberal offensive against social programs, again, at the expense of the popular classes. In effect, the plutocracy has come to understand that growth of their wealth will no longer come mainly from productive investment, but must come out of the hides of those below them. That requires imposing austerity on others so they can continue to prosper. Thomas Edsall, in his book, The Age of Austerity, How Scarcity Will Remake American Politics, sums up the situation as follows. Affluent Republicans, the donor and policy base of the conservative movement, are on red alert. They want to protect and enhance their position in a future of diminishing resources. What really provokes the ferocity with which the right currently fights for regressive tax and spending policies is a deeply pessimistic vision premised on a future of hard times. This vision has prompted the Republican Party to adopt a preemptive strategy that anticipates the end of growth and the onset of sustained austerity, a strategy to make sure that the size of their slice of the pie doesn't get smaller as the pie shrinks. It is in this light that we can understand the death march of the Republican Party that it is set out. Their survival and that of their patrons is at stake. It leads them to adopt scorched earth policies that ought to spell certain electoral defeat were it not for their gerrymandering, voter suppression, election rigging, and other anti-democratic measures needed to maintain power within the existing political duopoly. What they are so desperate to protect is not only their own political careers, but the insatiable hunger of capital. For its part, the Democratic Party is also beholden to the interests of transnational capital, as I pointed out earlier. As Jeff Foe has documented, as early as the Carter administration, it embraced the neoliberal ideology. The new Democrat, Bill Clinton, extended the Reagan-Bush 1 program of globalization with free trade, deregulation of finance capital. Remember, it was under Clinton that NAFTA was adopted. It was under Clinton that Glass-Steagall was repealed. The Obama administration has continued on this same course. The political elite is united on its basic priorities. As Foe remarks, the U.S. is no longer rich enough to continue to finance America's three principal national dreams. The dream of the business elite for subsidized, unregulated capitalism. The dream of the political elite for global hegemony. And the dream of the people for a steadily rising standard of living. Foe says we can certainly continue to have 1 out of 3, perhaps even 2 out of 3. But 3 out of 3, no way. It is the dream of the U.S. people we will have to go. That is the reality that no U.S. politician dares to utter. If he did, it might spark popular demands that dreams 1 and 2 should be sacrificed instead. But I would argue that the hard truth is that none of the 3 can be sustained indefinitely. Capitalism is in crisis. The military costs of global hegemony have become more than a debt-burdened state can sustain, as well as more than much of the world will continue to tolerate. As for rising living standards, even if the dreams of Wall Street and Washington did not trump those of the people, is this really sustainable? With only a small portion of the world's population, the U.S. consumes an immensely disproportionate share of the world's resources. The current rate of use of world resources globally would be sustainable if we had 1.5 planet Earths. Guess what? We only got 1. And the rest of the world's people also have dreams of rising standards of living. If all the people in the entire world enjoyed U.S. standards with the same per capita ecological footprint, 5 Earths would be needed. The American dream is no longer sustainable, not only because the unique historical circumstances that once supported it no longer exist, but also because the Earth can no longer support a continually rising level of production and consumption, even for that small portion of the world's population that has enjoyed such a high standard of living. The level of carbon emissions from the increasing use of fossil fuels in the global north since the Industrial Revolution has saturated the carrying capacity of the Earth's atmosphere. As a result, we are headed toward catastrophic climate change. And that is even without the industrialization that is developing in parts of the global south. Morally, it is difficult to deny the aspirations of the poorer sections of the world's population to rising standards of living. Global justice demands no less. But if that is not to exacerbate climate change, the global north will have to see reduced standards of living. In light of that, the downward mobility now being experienced is a step in the right direction. That may seem a shocking thing to say. Certainly it's not politically popular. And even less so as long as austerity for the many is matched by increasing opulence for the 0.01%. But if reduced consumption in the U.S. also entails reduced production and thus less carbon emissions, that could result in less inequality. All other factors being the same, which of course they never are. I've argued that the American dream is a public ideology that has legitimated the existing economic system of capitalism. Many have accepted the existing inequalities because they believe that it offers them the chance of moving upward in the existing system. Any realistic basis for that hope is vanishing. So what is there that can replace it? My slogan for the Occupy movement is on this button. It says, "Wake up from the American dream. Create a livable American reality." That is the challenge we the people face in the 21st century. And we have to face it with little help from our political elite and none from capital. We have to do it ourselves. It will take social movements and prolonged struggle. It will take courage and bold experimentation. And for starters, it will take speaking the truth. The American dream is over. For good or ill, history will move on without it. Besides this dominant American dream, there is an alternative one in the background. It has its roots in the 18th century Enlightenment and was expressed in the French Revolution with the slogan, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." That was the dream of a society in which all could live in community, a society of mutual support among equals, where each individual was free to develop his or her human capacities supported by the community. The basic values of that vision are deeply rooted in the American culture. It can be the basis of an alternative and sustainable American dream. A dream that treads lightly on the planet, because the good life is found not in the quantity of one's consumption or possessions, but in the quality of one's life in a human community. In the final analysis, capitalism is not compatible with such a dream. That requires that we invent a different economic system. And that is the challenge. That is a challenge that lies before us today. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I choked on my